I'll give you $500 if you translate this. The millionaire laughed, but Jesus Christ taught him a lesson. The laughter landed hard in the glass-walled boardroom, 62 floors above Manhattan, sharp and confident, the kind of sound that expected obedience. Rain streaked the windows of the Caldwell Biotech Tower, turning the city below into a blur of lights and shadows. Around the polished ebony table sat executives in tailored suits, linguists from elite universities and religious scholars flown in at enormous expense. All eyes followed the source of the laughter, Richard Caldwell, billionaire CEO, a man accustomed to buying outcomes. On the table, sealed beneath armored glass, rested a brittle parchment nearly 2,000 years old. It had defeated every expert brought before it. Millions had been spent. Reputations had stalled. Tonight was supposed to be another closed-door failure until the interruption. At the far end of the room, near the doors reserved for security, stood a man who did not belong. His clothes were simple. His sandals were worn. He carried no briefcase, no credentials, no visible fear. He had asked for work, not money, just food, and the request alone had ignited the room's amusement. Caldwell leaned back, amused by his own power. $500, he repeated, savoring the number as if it were bait. If you can translate it, in front of everyone. The executives chuckled. A linguist smirked. A rabbi exchanged an uneasy glance with a Vatican scholar. This was not scholarship anymore. It was spectacle. From the corner of the room, the assistant who had let the man in felt her stomach tighten. She had seen desperation before, but this was different. The stranger's posture was calm, almost reverent, as though the laughter passed through him without landing. He looked not at Caldwell, but at the manuscript itself through the glass, as if recognizing something familiar. Security shifted their weight, waiting for the order to remove him. Caldwell lifted a hand, enjoying the moment. "Let's make this interesting," he said. "When you fail, you walk out of this building on camera. The internet will love it." A hush followed. Rain thundered softly against the windows. In that silence, the stranger stepped forward, not hurried, not defiant. Those closest noticed his hands tremble, not with fear, but with something like grief. A scholar caught it and felt a chill run through him. Caldwell mistook the silence for surrender. He smiled wider. While he pressed, the man finally spoke, his voice steady, warm, carrying a weight that didn't ask permission to be heard. "I can translate it." The room froze. Laughter stalled mid-breath. For reasons no one could explain later, the air itself seemed to change, heavier, quieter, like the moment before a storm breaks. Somewhere deep inside the boardroom, beneath arrogance and credentials and glass, a question surfaced uninvited. What if this wasn't a joke? And what if the lesson about to be taught would cost far more than $500? The contrast in that room was impossible to ignore. Richard Caldwell stood at the head of the table like a man carved from certainty. His suit fit with surgical precision, his watch alone worth more than most homes in the city below. Years of headlines had taught him how to hold himself, shoulders squared, chin, lifted eyes that evaluated people the way balance sheets evaluate risk. To him, the boardroom was not just a place of work, it was territory. Everything inside it existed because he allowed it to. Around him, the others reflected his world. Executives spoke in numbers and timelines. Scholars carried the quiet arrogance of people used to being the smartest in the room. Each had arrived through layers of clearance and contracts, confident they belonged here. Even their silences felt rehearsed. And then there was the man by the glass case. He stood apart not by choice but by gravity, like a figure pulled from a different century and dropped into the present without explanation. His robe was clean but threadbare. His sandals bore the memory of long roads. He had no badge clipped to his chest, no folder tucked under his arm. He carried nothing except an unsettling stillness. Some noticed his eyes, first dark, attentive, not darting or defensive. Others noticed what he did not do. He did not scan the room for approval. He did not shrink beneath the weight of Caldwell's gaze. He did not react to the murmurs that passed behind polished hands. It was as if the rules that governed this room did not apply to him. A senior executive leaned toward another and whispered, irritated by the disruption. A linguist folded his arms, already dismissing the stranger as another opportunist chasing a miracle paycheck. From the far side of the table, a rabbi watched quietly, sensing something he could not yet name. while a Vatican scholar lowered his eyes unsettled by a feeling he had not felt in years. Caldwell studied the man openly now, curiosity sharpening into control. He had spent his life mastering leverage money over markets patents, over lives, silence over opposition. This man, however, brought none of the usual handles. No resume to mock, no credentials to dismantle, no visible fear to exploit. Who let him in? Caldwell asked casually, though everyone knew the question was rhetorical. The assistant's voice caught as she answered. He asked to help. He said he worked for food. That detail rippled across the room. Laughter followed, softer this time, edged with disbelief. In a space where million-dollar mistakes were corrected with signatures, the idea of working for food felt obscene. The stranger finally looked up from the manuscript. For a brief moment, his gaze crossed Caldwell's. It was not confrontational. It was not submissive. It carried something worse: recognition. As if he saw the man beneath the title, beneath the wealth, beneath the applause. Caldwell broke eye contact first. To him, the man represented disorder, an intrusion from a world he believed he had escaped long ago, the world of hunger dust and unanswered prayers. Caldwell had built his empire to rise above that world. He had renamed survival as success and necessity as weakness. Yet the stranger stood there unmoved, breathing the same air, occupying the same space, refusing to be reduced to a punchline. Two worlds faced each other across the length of the table. One believed power could be measured, stored, and defended. The other carried no visible power at all, yet did not bend. No one in the room could have said why, but something ancient stirred between them. Not rivalry, not curiosity, a collision. And once those worlds met, there would be no quiet way back to how things were before. The manuscript had become the axis around which everything in that room now revolved. Beneath its armored glass, the parchment lay motionless, its surface yellowed with age, edges softened by centuries. To the untrained eye, it looked fragile, almost unremarkable, inked lines arranged in unfamiliar patterns, tight and hurried as if the hand that wrote them had been racing against time. But everyone in that room knew its true weight. This was not paper. This was leverage, mystery, and legacy bound together. Richard Caldwell had acquired it 6 months earlier through channels that did not appear in annual reports. The discovery near the Judean desert had sent quiet shockwaves through academic circles, and Caldwell moved faster than museums, churches, and governments. $8 million changed hands before most scholars even knew the manuscript existed. For Caldwell, it was not an act of faith, it was conquest. He told himself it was about science, about history, about unlocking something ancient for the modern world. But those closest to him understood the truth. The manuscript had become personal. 5 teams of experts had tried and failed. Ivy League linguists wrestled with extinct dialects. Dead Sea Scroll specialists argued over grammar and syntax. A Vatican delegation translated nearly a third of the text before admitting defeat, their confidence eroding line by line. Each failure tightened Caldwell's grip. He was not used to being refused by anything, especially not by ink and skin. Every morning before markets opened, Caldwell stood alone in this room staring at the glass case. He memorized the stains, the creases, the density of the script. He learned the dimensions by heart: 30 centimeters by 20, writing on both sides, dense, urgent. In places, the ink pressed so deeply it seemed to bruise the parchment itself. The scholars called it complex. Caldwell called it defiant. To the executives, the manuscript was an investment risk. To the academics, it was a career-defining puzzle. To Caldwell, it was a mirror. Something ancient daring him to admit there were limits he could not buy his way past. Around the table, whispers carried their own weight. If this is authentic, one scholar murmured, it could alter first-century chronology. If it can be translated, another added carefully, it could challenge established theological assumptions. Caldwell listened without reacting. Possibility meant nothing without control. He had not paid millions for possibility. He had paid for certainty. That was why the failure enraged him. He had built a pharmaceutical empire by mastering formulas, isolating compounds, turning chaos into predictable outcomes. Diseases yielded. Markets yielded. Governments negotiated. This manuscript did none of those things. It remained closed, silent, immune to expertise. And now, standing only a few feet away, was a man who claimed he could open it. Caldwell glanced at the stranger again, irritation flickering beneath his composure. The contrast felt insulting. The manuscript represented power concentrated across centuries. The man before him represented nothing measurable at all. No credentials, no institutional backing, no fear of consequence. A senior linguist leaned closer to the glass, as if proximity alone might reveal what months of study had not. "The script is inconsistent," she said softly. It shifts tone, almost like she stopped herself, like memory, she had almost said. Across the room, the stranger's eyes remained fixed on the parchment. Those nearest to him noticed something unsettling. He did not study it the way scholars did. He did not trace letters with calculation or squint for patterns. He looked at it the way someone looks at a photograph from a life they once lived. For Caldwell, the manuscript was an object to be conquered. For the man in worn sandals, it seemed to be something else entirely. Not a puzzle, not a prize, but a witness waiting to speak. And as the rain continued to drum against the windows, one truth settled silently over the room. Whatever the manuscript revealed next would not belong to the one who paid the most for it, but to the one who understood it at its source. The challenge did not come wrapped in anger. It came dressed as entertainment. Richard Caldwell straightened fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, and the room responded the way it always did. Silence fell attentive and obedient. His expression carried the relaxed confidence of a man who had already decided the outcome. To him, this was no longer about the manuscript. It was about restoring order. "Let's be clear," Caldwell said, his voice calm, almost playful. "You say you can translate it. Fine. Then you'll do it here. Now, in front of everyone." A few executives exchanged looks. This was not procedure. This was theater. Caldwell continued savoring each condition, as if he were reading terms from a contract no one else had noticed. The translation would be spoken aloud, line by line. Every scholar in the room would listen. Every camera would be on. If the man stumbled, hesitated, or contradicted the experts, the attempt would end immediately. "And when you fail," Caldwell added lightly, "you leave this building escorted by security. We release the footage. No edits." A low murmur moved around the table. Someone smiled. Someone winced. A rabbi shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The stranger did not speak. Caldwell leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound reasonable. "You'll need to touch the manuscript," he said. "You can't translate a text like this through glass." Security stiffened at the implication. The manuscript was insured beyond imagination. Even the scholars had handled it only under strict protocols, gloved and supervised. "If you damage it," Caldwell continued, his tone still polite, "you'll be personally liable. Millions of dollars. I'll make sure of it." The cruelty of the offer lay not in its harshness, but in its precision. It was a legal trap disguised as generosity. A poor man invited to fail publicly, then punished privately. Caldwell had perfected such structures in boardrooms and court filings. This was simply another version. From the scholar's side of the table, reactions fractured. A linguist felt a flare of indignation, quickly smothered by curiosity. A Vatican scholar bowed his head, whispering a prayer he hadn't planned to say. The rabbi opened his mouth, then closed it again, sensing that protest would change nothing. The assistant near the door felt her throat tighten. She had seen Caldwell dismantle competitors with fewer words than this. Yet something about the stranger's stillness unsettled her, more than the threat itself. Caldwell turned his gaze fully on the man now. "You understand the terms?" he asked. The stranger met his eyes without flinching. There was no bargaining in his expression, no calculation, only a quiet resolve that did not rise or fall with the room's approval. "I understand," he said. That answer landed heavier than expected. Caldwell smiled, satisfied. To him, acceptance confirmed the narrative. Desperation always agreed eventually. Pride always collapsed when cornered by consequence. He gestured to security. "Bring the case." As the guards moved toward the glass enclosure, the room grew tense. Chairs creaked. Breath slowed. This was the point of no return. A scholar whispered, barely audible, "He shouldn't be allowed." Caldwell cut the thought short with a raised hand. He asked for the chance. The stranger stepped forward as the armored glass unlocked with a dull, mechanical click. The sound echoed like a door opening somewhere deeper than the room itself. No one noticed at first how the air changed, how the laughter had vanished, how even Caldwell's confidence sharpened into something brittle. What had begun as a spectacle had crossed into something else. Not a test, not a performance, but a judgment waiting to unfold, one that would not be decided by contracts, cameras, or money. And the cruel challenge, carefully designed to humiliate, had just placed the powerful and the powerless on the same unforgiving ground. The first sign did not announce itself with thunder. It came quietly, almost gently, the way truth often does when it enters a room uninvited. As the armored glass slid aside, the stranger stepped closer to the manuscript. Those nearest expected hesitation, fear, calculation, perhaps a final glance toward the exits. Instead, he stopped as if struck by something unseen. His shoulders tightened, his breath caught, and then, without warning, tears welled in his eyes. Not embarrassment, not panic, grief. The sight unsettled the room. Scholars who had stared at the parchment for months without emotion now felt something shift inside their chests. A linguist frowned, confused by her own reaction. A Vatican scholar felt his pulse quicken, an old instinct stirring one he had learned to silence in academic halls. Caldwell scoffed softly. Already, he said, mistaking tears for surrender. But the man did not step back. He raised a trembling hand hovering inches above the ancient skin, as though approaching something sacred. When his fingers finally touched the parchment, a sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. For a fraction of a second, no more than a heartbeat, the ink seemed to shimmer. It was subtle, a faint warmth, a soft golden sheen that moved along a line of text and then vanished as if it had never been there at all. "Did you see that?" someone whispered. "No," another replied too quickly. A senior linguist leaned closer, blaming the glass, the lighting, anything familiar. "Refraction," she muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. "The Murano chandeliers." But the rabbi had gone pale. He had seen reflections before. He had studied sacred texts his entire life. This was different. This felt responsive, as if the manuscript had recognized the touch. The man's tears fell freely now, darkening the parchment where they landed. Gasps spread as scholars instinctively moved forward, alarmed. Moisture could damage the ink. Centuries could be erased by a single careless moment. Yet where the tears touched the ink did not bleed. It held. A Vatican scholar crossed himself before realizing what he was doing. He lowered his hand quickly, glancing around, embarrassed but unable to dismiss the chill that had settled into his bones. The stranger closed his eyes briefly, as if steadying himself against a memory too heavy to carry alone. When he opened them again, something had changed. The humility remained, but beneath it now rested an unmistakable authority, not imposed, not asserted, simply present. Caldwell felt it, though he would never have admitted it aloud. His amusement faltered. This was not the performance he had anticipated. The room was no longer under his control in the way he understood control. Enough with the theatrics, Caldwell snapped more sharply than intended. "Translate." The man did not respond immediately. He kept his hand on the parchment, fingers splayed gently, reverently. Those closest noticed another detail that unsettled them even more. He was not reading, he was remembering. The symbols on the page no longer seemed like puzzles to him. His eyes did not move with scholarly calculation. They lingered, softened, as one might linger over names long loved and long lost. A scholar whispered, "That dialect, no one speaks it like that anymore." The rabbi swallowed hard. "No one has," he said quietly, "for 2,000 years. Silence pressed in from all sides. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows. Inside, careers, assumptions, and certainties stood trembling on a knife's edge. These were only the first signs, small, easily dismissed if one tried hard enough. But for those who felt the shift in the air, one truth had already become unavoidable. Whatever was unfolding here did not belong to the realm of demonstrations or tricks. Something ancient had awakened, and it had not come to be tested. When the stranger began to speak, the room forgot how to breathe. The first words did not come in English. They flowed in a tongue no one had heard spoken aloud in centuries, ancient, guttural, and precise. Aramaic, yes, but not the reconstructed version scholars debated in classrooms. This was Galilean Aramaic of the first century, shaped by dust in marketplaces, by fishermen and laborers, by a land long vanished. A rabbi's hand flew to the edge of the table to steady himself. His lips parted, but no sound came out. A linguist from Cambridge felt her pulse spike as recognition collided with disbelief. The cadence was wrong for modern imitation. The stress patterns, the breath, the pauses between phrases, no one learned that from books. Caldwell frowned. This was not what he had paid for. Translate, he snapped. Not recite. The man opened his eyes, and then he did. The translation unfolded not as a lecture, but as a living account. Line by line, the ancient words became modern speech, precise, yet unforced, carrying meaning that reached beyond grammar. Names emerged, places, emotions implied but never written. He did not pause to analyze syntax or hedge with academic caution. He spoke as one remembering events already lived. A scholar interrupted, unable to contain herself. That line only has 11 words, she said sharply. You're giving us nearly 50. The man turned toward her, his expression gentle but unwavering. Because the writer was hiding, he replied. He wrote quickly. He left things unsaid. Silence followed. He continued explaining shifts in tense. No one had resolved references scholars had misattributed for decades. He clarified why certain phrases bent grammar, because the author was wounded, because his hand shook, because soldiers were nearby. These were not theories. They were recollections. The Vatican scholar leaned forward, whispering to his colleague, "He's correcting the text." "Impossible," the other murmured, though his eyes betrayed awe. Dates aligned with uncanny precision. Cultural nuances emerged that no modern reconstruction had captured. Even disputed chronologies, arguments that had filled journals for generations, were addressed not defensively, but simply as if the answers had always been obvious. Caldwell's confidence began to crack. This was not translation as performance. This was not even translation as expertise. It was something far more dangerous: translation as authority. Not borrowed, not inferred, inherent. He shouldn't know that, an executive whispered. That detail was never published. A rabbi sank back into his chair, whispering a prayer under his breath. "That's how we spoke," he said, voice trembling. "That's how my teacher said we once spoke." The man's voice faltered briefly, not from uncertainty but from emotion. His hand tightened against the parchment as he reached a passage dense with ink and meaning. When he spoke again, his voice softened. "He was afraid here," the man said quietly. But he kept writing. Caldwell slammed his palm against the table. "Enough," he said, louder than necessary. "You expect us to believe this is coincidence?" The man met his gaze without anger. "No," he said. "I expect you to recognize it." The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had drawn closer. Careers, egos, and assumptions lay scattered across the floor, broken by something no one had prepared for. Because the impossible translation had done more than unlock ancient words. It had exposed an unsettling truth. The manuscript was no longer being decoded. It was being returned to someone who had never needed to learn its language in the first place. The shift came not with a shout, but with a name. As the translation continued, the stranger's voice slowed, reverent now, as though approaching ground remembered too well. He reached a passage scholars had long labeled fragmented lines, dense, hurried, interrupted by smears of ink that suggested panic or pain. "This is where the author stops hiding," the man said quietly. A linguist leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "The name here is incomplete," she said. "Just consonants. We've debated it for decades." The man did not look down at the text when he answered. Because he was ashamed, he said. But he wanted the truth to remain. Then he spoke the name aloud. Dismas. The sound of it cut through the room like a bell struck once and left to ring. Several scholars stiffened at the same moment. A rabbi's breath hitched. The Vatican scholar's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered against the table. "The good thief," someone whispered. The man nodded, his expression weighted with memory. "Yes, the one crucified to the right." He continued translating, and the manuscript opened in a way no one had expected. The words were no longer abstract theology or disputed history. They became a confession, raw, urgent, unfinished. Dismas writing in the final hours of his life, recording not doctrine, but encounter. Fear, regret, hope that arrived too late to earn, and yet was given freely. He writes faster here, the man explained, touching the dense lines. His breathing was failing. His hands were bound, but not completely. He did not want the moment to be lost. A scholar interrupted, voice shaking. "That contradicts Roman execution protocol." The man looked at her with quiet patience. "Only if you assume the guards followed protocol." A murmur spread. Details emerged, small, devastatingly precise. the placement of the crosses, the order of execution, the hour when the sky darkened, not mid-afternoon as some traditions claimed, but earlier when fear moved through the crowd like a living thing. He corrects the hour, the man said softly, because he was watching the sun. The Vatican scholar's face drained of color. This resolved a dispute older than any institution in the room. Caldwell stood rigid now, hands clenched at his sides. The manuscript he had bought to conquer was slipping out of his control, transforming into something that no longer belonged to him. Names had power, and this name carried 2,000 years of unresolved meaning. Why him, Caldwell demanded. Why does this matter? The man turned toward him slowly. Because Dismas had nothing left, he said. No future, no reputation, no good works to bargain with. Silence followed. He was guilty, the man continued, and he knew it. That is why his words are true. The room felt heavier. Executives avoided eye contact. Scholars sat frozen as if afraid to disturb what was unfolding. For the first time, the manuscript was no longer an artifact. It was a voice, a dying man's voice. And as the stranger spoke the final lines of Dismas's confession, something unsettled the room even more deeply. The translation did not end with despair. It ended with recognition. With a promise, the man said, his voice low, spoken not by a criminal, but by the one between us. No one asked who that was. They were beginning to understand. The manuscript had revealed its author, but in doing so, it had pointed beyond itself to a cross, to a choice, and to a mercy that had never been meant for scholars alone. And the name Dismas no longer belonged only to history. It hovered in the room like a mirror, asking each person present which side of the cross they were standing on now. What happened next shattered the last refuge of skepticism. It began with a simple question from one of the medical consultants Caldwell had invited for credibility, not faith. A trauma surgeon, gray-haired and precise, cleared his throat. If this account is accurate, he said carefully, the injuries described would leave marks. Distinct ones. The room held its breath. The stranger did not argue. He did not explain. He simply nodded. Slowly, deliberately, he extended his hands. Not the palms as centuries of art had portrayed, but the wrists, where iron would have held weight, where bone could support a body. There beneath weathered skin lay round scars, pale and unmistakable. Not surgical, not accidental. Old, healed, permanent. The surgeon stood halfway out of his chair. That placement, he murmured, that's consistent with Roman crucifixion. Modern reconstructions confirmed it decades ago, but no one, he stopped himself, unable to finish the sentence. A linguist pressed a hand to her mouth. Another scholar turned away, shaken. The rabbi's eyes filled with tears he did not try to hide. The stranger lifted his tunic, slightly exposing his side. Along the rib cage ran a scar, jagged at the edges, angled upward, the unmistakable path of a spear thrust meant to confirm death. A hush fell so complete that the hum of the city outside seemed distant, unreal. This wound, the man said quietly, came after the breathing stopped. The surgeon swallowed hard. That would mean the heart sac was pierced, the man finished gently. Blood and water. The words rippled through the room. Scripture, anatomy, and history collided in a way no academic framework could contain. Caldwell stepped back instinctively, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. This proves nothing, he said, but the denial rang hollow even to his own ears. Scars can be faked. Special effects. The surgeon cut him off, voice unsteady. Not like this. Not with this pattern. Not with this age. He stepped closer, forgetting protocol. These wounds healed naturally. Over decades. You can't manufacture that. Silence swallowed the room again. The stranger lowered his hands. There was no triumph in his posture. No demand for belief. Only patience. For years, he said softly, you have argued about the cross as an idea, a symbol, a theory. His eyes moved across the room, resting briefly on each face. But the cross was not a concept. It was a method. The words landed with brutal clarity. A Vatican scholar whispered, my God, and this time did not stop himself. Caldwell's face had gone pale. The empire he had built on certainty was cracking under the weight of something that could not be litigated, purchased, or dismissed. He had invited experts to control the narrative. Now the narrative was staring back at him alive. The wounds were not evidence meant to persuade. They were reminders. Reminders that suffering had a body, that sacrifice left marks, that history when encountered honestly demanded a response. No one in the room asked for further proof. They had just seen what no manuscript, no translation, no argument could ever fully convey. The cost had been written into flesh, and the room understood at last that they were no longer debating a past event. They were standing in the presence of it. No lightning split the sky. No voice thundered from above. The revelation came the same way everything else had that night, quietly without spectacle, impossible to ignore. After the scars were shown, no one spoke. The room felt suspended between seconds as if time itself had stepped back. Scholars who had argued for decades found no words left to defend. Executives stared at the floor. Even Richard Caldwell, who had never lacked language to dominate a room, stood motionless, his confidence drained of color. The man waited, not like someone cornered, like someone allowing space. At last, a Vatican scholar broke the silence, his voice barely audible. Who are you?" The stranger turned toward him. There was no drama in the movement, no rehearsed gravity. His face held weariness and compassion in equal measure, the kind earned only through suffering freely chosen. "I am the one Dismas wrote about," he said. The words settled heavily, not as a claim, but as a truth remembered. "I am the one between the two." A sharp breath echoed from somewhere near the windows. The rabbi's hands trembled openly now. The surgeon closed his eyes as if bracing against something too vast to hold. Caldwell shook his head, a laugh escaping him, thin, fractured. "No," he said. "That's impossible." "You're asking us to believe I am not asking," the man replied gently. His eyes met Caldwell's, and for the first time the billionaire felt exposed, not accused, but seen. Every calculated decision, every compromise justified as necessity, every life reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. "I am Jesus Christ." The name did not explode. It descended. It carried weight the room could not repel. Somewhere a chair scraped softly as someone sat down, legs unable to hold their weight. A linguist pressed her palms together, whispering a prayer she hadn't spoken since childhood. The Vatican scholar lowered himself to his knees without realizing when he had moved. Jesus did not command attention. He did not demand belief. He spoke as one who had already paid the cost of being rejected. "You have studied me," he continued calmly, "debated my words, measured my impact. You have turned my life into theories and institutions." His gaze returned to the manuscript. "But I did not come to be analyzed." He looked back at the room. "I came to be known." Caldwell's mouth opened, then closed. His empire had been built on certainty, on owning outcomes. This moment offered neither, only a choice. "You stand among artifacts," Jesus said, "but you are afraid of truth." No one challenged him. "You search the past to control the present," he continued. "But the past is not locked away. It speaks. It bleeds. It forgives." The rain outside softened as if the city itself were listening. Jesus took a step back from the table, creating distance rather than closing it. "I did not come to condemn you," he said, and his voice carried neither threat nor relief. "That has never been my way." The words hung there, merciful, terrifying, because condemnation would have been easier. As Jesus fell silent, the room understood something with unsettling clarity. This was not a vision, not a metaphor, not a story to be edited, framed, or dismissed. This was Jesus Christ present, embodied, undeniable. And everything that followed would depend not on proof, but on response. The confrontation did not begin with anger. It began with truth spoken plainly without elevation or escape. Jesus turned fully toward Richard Caldwell. The room seemed to recede as if walls, titles, and witnesses no longer mattered. For the first time that night, the billionaire felt singled out, not humiliated, not threatened, but addressed. "You have asked what your sin is," Jesus said quietly. Caldwell stiffened. His jaw tightened instinctively, preparing for negotiation for defense. This was how he survived, by reframing, by redirecting, by proving necessity. "You tell yourself you are not cruel," Jesus continued. "You tell yourself you are practical, that markets decide, that systems require sacrifice." A murmur passed through the executives, uncomfortable now. These were arguments they had all used. Jesus did not raise his voice. He did not accuse with spectacle. "You did not strike the sick," he said. You did not order them to die. Caldwell exhaled sharply, seizing the opening. Exactly, he said. I didn't, but you priced them. Jesus finished. The words landed with surgical precision. Silence followed. You calculated how much a life was worth, Jesus went on, and you accepted the margin. Images flickered across the room, reports, charts, closed-door meetings where affordability had outweighed urgency. A senior executive swallowed hard, remembering a vote taken late one night, a delay approved, a rollout postponed, numbers adjusted downward. Caldwell shook his head, voice rising. I created medicine that saves millions. Without us, there would be nothing. Jesus nodded slowly. You did create much, he said, and much was entrusted to you. Then his voice lowered. That is why the cost is greater. The air grew heavy. You speak of lives saved, Jesus continued, but you do not speak of the ones left behind. The parents who counted pills, the children who watched time run out, the clinics that closed their doors because hope became unaffordable. Caldwell's confidence fractured. I had shareholders, he said, almost pleading now. Regulations. Competition. If I hadn't done it, someone else would have. Jesus met his gaze steadily. That is what Dismas said, he replied, before he was lifted onto the cross. The comparison cut deep. He blamed the world, Jesus said, until he saw himself clearly. Caldwell took a step back, breath uneven. This was no longer philosophy. This was exposure. You were given power, Jesus said, and power always asks the same question. Who will you let suffer so you do not have to? No one in the room could look at Caldwell now. Not out of judgment, but recognition. Jesus did not condemn him. That was the hardest part. There is still time, Jesus said softly, but time is not endless. The words were not a threat. They were a boundary. You are not beyond mercy, Jesus continued. But mercy is not cheap. It does not excuse. It transforms. Caldwell stared at the floor, his empire suddenly small beneath his feet. He had prepared for lawsuits, for public outrage, for hostile takeovers. He had not prepared for this. The real sin had been named not greed alone, not pride alone, but the quiet decision to let others bear the cost of his success. And now the truth stood before him, not demanding payment, only a choice. Grace, when it finally arrived, did not sound like relief. It sounded like an invitation that carried weight. Jesus did not rush Richard Caldwell. He did not corner him with demands or soften the moment with comforting phrases. The room waited suspended between what had been revealed and what still could be chosen. You want to know what repentance looks like? Jesus said at last. Caldwell lifted his head, eyes rimmed with red. He had expected a lecture, perhaps an apology, to be issued, a donation large enough to silence outrage. That was how problems were solved in his world, through gestures calibrated to preserve control. Jesus dismantled that illusion with a single sentence. Sell it. The word echoed blunt and unadorned. The companies, Jesus continued. The patents. The stock that ties you to power. A sharp intake of breath rippled across the room. An executive whispered, he can't mean, but the thought died unfinished. Release what you hoard. Jesus set his voice steady. Cancel the debts that keep the sick waiting. Lower the prices that turn hope into privilege. Caldwell shook his head instinctively. That would collapse everything, he said. Thousands of jobs, entire systems. Jesus nodded. Yes. The acknowledgement struck harder than resistance would have. Grace is not damage control. Jesus continued. It does not preserve the throne. He stepped closer, not threatening, not coaxing. It sets the captives free, including the one who built the prison. The scholars listened in stunned silence. They had expected metaphor. What they heard was dismantling. You want forgiveness, Jesus said, but forgiveness without transformation is just relief. Caldwell's hands trembled. His life flashed before him, not as memories, but as infrastructure boards, buildings, legal frameworks, alliances that had taken decades to secure. To surrender them was to erase the very identity he had constructed. There has to be another way, he said hoarsely. A fund, a foundation. I'll give more than anyone ever has. Jesus looked at him with something like sorrow. Dismas had nothing to give, he said, and that is why he was free. Silence pressed in again. Mercy is offered, Jesus continued, but it cannot be purchased. It costs the one who receives it everything he believes makes him safe. The weight of the choice settled visibly on Caldwell's shoulders. This was not charity. This was death to self. Around the room, faces reflected the cost of the moment. An executive imagined her own compromises. A scholar realized knowledge had never demanded this kind of surrender. The assistant by the door felt tears slide down her face without understanding why. Jesus waited. He always did. Caldwell took a step back, then another. His breathing quickened, not with fear of loss, but with the terror of emptiness of becoming a man, without leverage, without guarantees. "I can't," he said finally. The words came out small, stripped of authority. Not all of it. Jesus did not argue. He nodded once. The offer of grace had been made, not cheap, not hidden, not coerced. It stood complete, whole, terrifying in its simplicity. And the room understood that refusal too was a choice, a costly one. Jesus did not linger after the refusal. There was no anger in his departure, no final warnings shouted across the room. He simply stepped back from the table, allowing the weight of the choice to settle where it belonged. The scholars remained frozen. The executives stared at the floor. Richard Caldwell stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by everything he owned and unable to move. When Jesus turned toward the exit, the air shifted once more, not with fear this time, but with a quiet finality. Those closest to the doors swore later that the lights dimmed for just a moment, as if the room itself were exhaling. Then he was gone. No guards escorted him, no cameras followed, no one stopped him. The manuscript remained on the table, inert, now ink, dull parchment, silent. Whatever life it had carried moments before was gone like a voice that had finished speaking. In the weeks that followed, the boardroom returned to business. The meeting was never recorded. Non-disclosure agreements were signed. Official statements described the night as an unsuccessful consultation. The world moved on as it always does, but the people in that room did not. Some changed quietly. A linguist resigned her post and returned to teaching, no longer able to treat ancient words as puzzles alone. A Vatican scholar entered a monastery shaken by the realization that faith was never meant to be managed at a distance. The assistant who had opened the door that night began volunteering at a free clinic, haunted by a question she could not shake. What does it cost to look away? Richard Caldwell lived 3 more years. He remained wealthy, powerful, untouchable, but those close to him noticed the cracks, sleepless nights, meetings canceled without explanation, a restlessness no acquisition could quiet. When illness finally came, it did not arrive as punishment, but as silence and ending that offered no more opportunities to revise the answer he had already given. And yet the story does not end with him, because the real legacy of that night was never the manuscript, the scars, or the revelation. It was the question that lingered long after Jesus left the room. Not who was he, but what would you have done? The same choice still stands today. Most people will never sit across from a billionaire in a glass tower, but everyone faces moments where power and compassion collide, decisions where profit outweighs people, where comfort demands silence, where walking away costs less than stepping forward. The story of Dismas reminds us that redemption is possible even at the very end, but not without humility. The story of Caldwell warns that success, when protected at all costs, can quietly become a prison. And the presence of Jesus Christ in that room reminds us of something even more unsettling and hopeful. Grace still comes close. Grace still asks. And grace is never cheap. It does not demand perfection, but it does demand honesty. And it always leaves the choice in human hands. If this story made you pause, if it stirred questions you've been avoiding, don't ignore that moment. That hesitation might be where transformation begins. We invite you to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who needs encouragement or clarity today. And leave a comment below. Which choice would you make, Caldwell's or Dismas's? Here on our channel, we tell stories that challenge, heal, and remind us that faith is not a relic of the past. It is alive, demanding, and deeply relevant to the world we live in now. Thank you for watching, and stay with us for the next story, because grace may be closer than you think.